Indian boarding schools, ethnocide or kindness? The Carlisle School, a 19th century boarding school for Native American children, was created as a model to promote the assimilation of Native Americans into the mainstream Euro-American culture. It is well documented that terrible abuses took place, and the ethnocentric methodology of the schools is now seen as controversial. However, many people, Native and mainstream alike, supported the schools for nearly a century. How can these seeming opposites be reconciled? Were the schools of any lasting benefit? From the time of the earliest European contact with the native indigenous peoples, colonists sought to promote their European culture at the expense of the native cultures. The superiority of the Euro-American model was a widely held ethnocentric view at the time. Its dominance was assumed as a foregone conclusion. Sometimes the early policies sought to merge tribal traditions with the Euro-American cultural traditions so people could peacefully live together. Later, these humanitarian ideals were abandoned, and the total assimilation of tribes into the mainstream was instead pursued, often under the banner of benevolent assimilation. Education was viewed as the primary means to be used in the acculturation process. Public demand was for education to be used to encourage a standard set of cultural values and practices to be held in common by the majority of American citizens. Launched from a successful educational program developed for Native American prisoners of the Indian Wars, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was founded in 1879. It was seen by many in both cultures to provide new opportunities for Native American children. Immersing the children in the larger Euro-American culture would help them adapt to life in the burgeoning new modern world. Carlisle adopted the curriculum of the many popular industrial schools of the day, which already served a wide cross-section of American children. It included vocational training for the boys and domestic science for the girls, taught in the Euro-American style. Carlisle became the pattern for most of the later schools to be sponsored by the government's Bureau of Indian Affairs. The guiding philosophy was that the Indian was, quote, born blank, like the rest of us. If you transfer the savage-born infant to the surroundings of a civilization, he will grow to possess a civilized language and habit, end quote. It was widely believed that this was all the Indian needed to be, quote, freed from his aboriginal culture and to be fully assimilated into the American mainstream society. The approach was forward-thinking as it regarded Native Americans as being worthy of respect and capable of participation in society, whereas most of Euro-American society regarded Native Americans as nearly subhuman and savage. A collision of cultures immediately manifested itself in trying to run the schools, too often ending with tragic consequences. For the young children sent to the schools, the environment itself was a traumatic experience. Torn from their parents, children's lives were altered drastically upon arrival. Given new haircuts, new clothing, and even new English-based names, they were forced to change immediately. They could no longer speak their own tongue, even with each other. The skills that were taught could not be used in a traditional Native American setting. Grueling chores, stiff punishments, and sometimes physical, mental, or sexual abuse occurred. In almost every way, the children were forced to abandon their Native American cultures and identities. The number of Native American children in boarding schools reached its peak in the 1970s. Since then, Native American nations have taken back control of the education of their children and started their own schools and colleges locally, many on the reservations. Carlisle and similar schools have been seen as controversial, and many say these policies forced children through undue hardship to leave their families, to give up their own culture, their language, their religion, even their own names, which inflicted lasting psychological damage. The practice of the Americanization of Native Americans by forced cultural assimilation is regarded by some as cultural genocide. On the other hand, more Native Americans are today living in urban environments, pursuing modern, successful careers and having to accommodate contemporary society, just as originally envisioned. It was said, quote, kill the Indian to save the man, end quote. Though started as a campaign for the fair and humane treatment of Native Americans in the context of the era, the legacy of the boarding school program is viewed by some modern Native American people to be a cruel example cultural genocide which targeted children.